would have been dead within a couple of hours. Shannon's injuries, according to the doctor, occurred with a good measure of time between them. She indicated that Channon had suffered blows to the head at some point. She had been grabbed. Her arms had been grabbed by someone forcefully enough to cause bruising. She was forced to perform oral sex.
Before we begin, a small warning. This episode covers a real case involving kidnapping, sexual violence, torture, and murder. Some of what you are about to hear is difficult to sit with. If you are sensitive to this kind of content, please take care of yourself and feel free to skip this one. On the afternoon of January 7th, 2007, a railroad worker was walking a stretch of track near Chipman Street in Knoxville, Tennessee, checking the line the way he did most days, when something near the gravel caught his eye. It was not scrap metal, it was not debris blown in from the wind. As he stepped closer, the shape resolved into something his mind did not want it to be: a body, bound, wrapped, partially burned, left beside the rails, as if it were nothing more than trash to be discarded. Within hours, investigators confirmed the fear that had already begun spreading through the community overnight. The body belonged to Christopher Newsom, 23 years old, missing since a dinner date the evening before that never ended the way it was supposed to. What almost nobody in Knoxville knew yet, what the police themselves did not fully grasp in those first hours, was that the young woman who had been with him that night, the woman who should have come home with him, was still alive. Not free, not safe. Alive, in the hands of the very same people who had already killed the man she loved. Inside a rented house, less than a mile from where his body now lay. This is the story of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom, two ordinary young people from Knoxville whose Saturday night plans turned into one of the most brutal crimes in Tennessee history, and whose families are, even now, nearly 2 decades later, still walking into courtrooms fighting for a justice that was supposed to have arrived a long time ago. Quick thing before we get into it: if you are new here, go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next case we cover. Short and simple. Now, let us get back to the story. Who they were. Channon Gail Christian was 21 years old, a senior at the University of Tennessee, working toward a degree she was close to finishing and a future she had already started planning around it. Friends described her as warm and grounded, the kind of daughter who called her parents, Gary and Dina, just to talk, not because anything was wrong. She had a wide, easy laugh that people who knew her still bring up when they talk about her, even all these years later. She had a serious relationship, a tight circle of friends, and by every account, a life that was steadily coming together exactly the way she wanted it to. Christopher, known to nearly everyone as Chris, was 23, a graduate of Halls High School, with a reputation as an easygoing, dependable guy, the kind of person friends called when they needed help, not because he offered, but because he simply showed up. He had played baseball growing up, well enough and often enough that the community still holds a memorial tournament in his name every year at Halls Community Park. He and Channon had been together long enough that both families considered it a real relationship, one with a future attached to it. On the night of January 6, 2007, the two of them had plans that were about as unremarkable as plans get. Dinner, time with friends, then home. The way most Saturday nights go for most young couples. Neither family had any reason to worry that first evening. Saturday nights like this one had happened dozens of times before. Dinner, friends, a drive home. The small, unremarkable rhythm of two young people who had built a life together out of exactly this kind of ordinary routine. Nobody warns a couple like Chris and Channon that a routine parking lot at a friend's apartment complex they had visited many times before could turn into the last place either of them would ever feel safe again. They never made it to either one. The night it happened, Channon picked Chris up that evening in her Toyota 4Runner, the same vehicle she had worked to be able to afford, the same vehicle that would later become the reason 4 strangers targeted her at all. The couple drove to an apartment complex off Cherokee Trail on Washington Ridge to spend part of the evening with friends of Chris before heading home for the night. At some point after they arrived in that apartment complex parking lot, 4 men approached the vehicle. Investigators would later determine that the group had been actively looking for a car to steal that night, moving through the complex with exactly that goal in mind, and Channon's forerunner became the one they settled on. Chris and Channon were forced back into their own vehicle at gunpoint. From that parking lot, a drive of only about 10 minutes took them to a rented house at 2316 Chipman Street, a modest, unremarkable home in a quiet Knoxville neighborhood, the kind of street where neighbors later said they never noticed anything that gave them reason for concern. Inside that house, over the following hours, both Chris and Channon were bound. Both were beaten. Both were repeatedly raped by more than one of the men who had taken them. What investigators eventually reconstructed, piecing it together through DNA evidence, forensic analysis, and the statements later given by those involved, described a night and a following day of violence that even veteran detectives called some of the worst they had ever worked. Chris was killed first, shot, his body wrapped, then carried to the railroad tracks near the house where he would be found the next afternoon. Channon was kept alive longer than he was. She endured additional hours of assault before she was ultimately suffocated, her body sealed inside garbage bags and hidden in trash cans in the kitchen of the very house where she had spent her final hours. We are not going to walk through every detail the medical examiner documented in that autopsy. Much of it is part of the public court record for anyone who wants that level of detail. What matters here, for understanding the shape of this case, is this. The violence inflicted on both of them was not a single frantic outburst. It was deliberate. It stretched across hours, involved more than one person, and was carried out through a long chain of decisions that could have stopped at any point and simply did not. There is one detail from the court record worth sitting with, not for shock value, but because of what it tells us about those final hours. According to Davidson's own later statements, at some point during her captivity, Channon asked him directly whether she was going to die. It is a small detail, only a handful of words, but it tells you that in the middle of everything happening to her, she was still fully present, still aware, still asking the single most human question a person can ask once they understand what is coming. That detail has stayed with the investigators and prosecutors who worked this case for nearly 2 decades now, because it removes any possibility of pretending this was anything other than exactly what it was. The people responsible. 5 people were eventually charged in connection with what happened at Chipman Street. Lamarcus Davidson, considered the ringleader by prosecutors, lived at the house and had an extensive prior criminal history. Latalvis Cobbins, Davidson's half-brother, and George Thomas, a friend of both men, were present in the house and took part directly in the crimes. Vanessa Coleman, who was dating Cobbins at the time, was also inside the house throughout much of what happened. A 5th man, Eric Boyd, was not present for the kidnapping itself, but became central to the case afterward, accused of helping Davidson hide from police once the manhunt began, a role that would later prove far larger than investigators initially understood. Court records would later show that 4 of the 5 people charged, Boyd, Cobbins, Davidson, and Thomas, already had multiple prior felony convictions before that January night, a fact prosecutors would point to repeatedly while arguing for the harshest sentences available. Davidson, in particular, had a documented pattern of serious criminal behavior stretching back years, and investigators later established that he was the one who directed much of what happened once Chris and Channon were brought inside the house. Cobbins, as Davidson's half-brother, and Thomas, as a close friend of both men, were not strangers pulled into a crime by accident. They were part of the same circle, present in that house by choice, and prosecutors argued each of them made his own independent decisions to participate rather than simply being swept along by someone else's actions. Coleman's role was described differently throughout the case, more as someone present in the house who failed to stop what was happening and who took part in certain aspects of the crime, which is part of why her verdicts, in both her original trial and her retrial, ultimately looked different from the men's. What makes this case difficult to sit with, even for people who follow true crime closely, is how ordinary the beginning of that night actually was. Chris and Channon were not looking for trouble. They were visiting friends, the way any young couple might on any given Saturday. They had no history with any of the men who took them, no dispute, no prior contact of any kind, nothing either of them could have possibly seen coming. Prosecutors later argued, and the courts later agreed, that Davidson and the others could have simply taken the vehicle they wanted and let two strangers walk away unharmed. Instead, they made the choice to bring two people into a house and keep them there. Finding Chris. When Chris and Channon did not come home Saturday night, both families started making calls, first to each other, then to friends, then, as the hours stretched into Sunday morning with no word from either of them, to the police. Investigators quickly learned that Channon's forerunner was missing along with the couple, and a report was filed that morning, though at that point nobody yet understood the scale of what they were actually dealing with. That changed Sunday afternoon, when the railroad workers' discovery near Chipman Street pushed the case into an entirely different, far more urgent category. Chris had been shot, his body bound at the ankles with a belt, a shoelace securing one wrist behind his back, his head wrapped before he was left beside the tracks. Detectives moved fast once they had a body and a location, and it did not take long before a fingerprint recovered from the vehicle connected to the scene led them directly to Lamarcus Davidson, and from Davidson to the rental house sitting quietly less than a mile away. Finding Channon. While detectives worked to identify Davidson and tie him to the house on Chipman Street, they still had no idea where Channon was, or whether she was even alive. When investigators finally entered that house, the answer to that question came in the worst possible way. In the kitchen, sealed inside garbage bags placed in trash cans, was Channon's body. She had been there the entire time detectives were combing the surrounding neighborhood looking for her. The forensic evidence recovered from that house told investigators almost everything they would eventually need to build their case, and it built a chain of connections that would leave almost no room for doubt once the case went to trial. DNA recovered from Channon's body matched multiple suspects, tying more than one man in that house directly to the assault. Fingerprints and palm prints found on the garbage bags used to conceal her matched Davidson directly, including a palm print consistent with someone lifting a bag that had weight inside it, a small physical detail that quietly confirmed exactly what investigators already suspected. Fabric used to bind Channon and fabric recovered with Chris's body were both traced back to curtains that had been in Davidson's possession. Personal items belonging to both victims, including Chris's shoes, a cell phone, and other belongings, were later recovered both from the Chipman Street house and from the separate vacant property where Davidson was ultimately found hiding, alongside a revolver that would later be matched to the bullets recovered from Chris's body. Every one of these pieces on its own might have been circumstantial. Together, laid side by side the way prosecutors eventually laid them out for a jury, they formed a case that left almost nothing open to argument, which is part of why what happened next in the courtroom felt so unbelievable to the families watching it unfold. The manhunt. Davidson fled the area almost immediately after the bodies were discovered, moving between locations with help from Eric Boyd, who assisted him more than once in finding new places to hide, including a friend's apartment, a wooded area, and finally an empty house the two of them broke into specifically to stay out of sight. Boyd also worked to find a vehicle that could get Davidson out of the area entirely, according to statements later given to investigators. It did not work. On January 11, 2007, just 5 days after the murders, Davidson was arrested by Knoxville police inside that vacant house. Cobbins and Thomas did not stay in Tennessee at all. Both fled almost immediately, and both were located and arrested that same day, January 11th, in Lebanon, Kentucky, roughly 200 miles from Knoxville. Within less than a week of the murders, all 4 primary suspects were in police custody. For the Christian and Newsom families, this should have marked the beginning of the end. Instead, it was only the start of one of the longest-running legal battles East Tennessee has ever seen. A community in shock Knoxville is not a small town, but it is the kind of city where a crime like this touches nearly everyone within a few connections. Chris had grown up there, played ball there, gone to school there, and in the days after his body was found, the Halls community held vigils that drew far more people than organizers expected, neighbors and strangers alike standing together in the cold in a show of grief that people who were there still describe as overwhelming. At the same time, something else began to trouble both families almost immediately. The sense that the case was not receiving the level of national attention many similar crimes had received in the past. Local East Tennessee outlets covered every development closely, but for weeks, the story struggled to break through into national conversation the way other high-profile kidnapping and murder cases had. Some community leaders spoke publicly about why that gap might exist. Reverend Ezra Mays, who led the Knoxville chapter of the NAACP at the time, addressed the case directly, saying that speaking out against the crime was not complicated for him simply because the people responsible were black and the victims were white, calling it plainly a matter of right and wrong rather than a matter of race, and stating clearly that whoever committed the crime should face the full consequences of what they had done. His comments were widely quoted at the time, an early voice cutting through what many in the community felt was a frustrating silence from national media outlets. Whatever the reason for that gap, it did not stop the case from becoming and remaining one of the defining criminal cases in East Tennessee's history, discussed in courtrooms, classrooms, and living rooms across the region for years afterward. A case that would not stay closed. The first trials, beginning in 2009, ended in convictions. LaTalvis Cobbins was found guilty that August of facilitating both murders, though he was acquitted of raping Chris, and he was sentenced to life without parole. Lamarcus Davidson was convicted that October, and the jury chose unanimously to sentence him to death on the capital charges, adding an additional 80 years on top of that for the remaining convictions against him. For a while, it looked like the case was finally moving toward closure. Then, in 2011, everything the families believed had been settled came apart at once. The judge who had presided over the trials, Richard Baumgartner, resigned after it became public that he had been struggling with drug abuse throughout the proceedings, along with improper conduct involving a defendant in an entirely unrelated case. Under Tennessee law at the time, a judge is required to act as what is called the 13th juror, reviewing and effectively co-signing a jury's verdict before it becomes final. Baumgartner's conduct during the trials put every verdict he had overseen into question. A new judge, John Carey Blackwood, was brought in to review the convictions, and in June 2012, he granted new trials for Davidson, Cobbins, and Thomas, ruling he could not fulfill the 13th juror role given everything that had come out about Baumgartner. Prosecutors pushed back hard, arguing that Blackwood himself had become too personally involved in the case, citing his own communication with the defense outside of proper channels. After Blackwood was removed, yet another judge, Walter Kurtz, was assigned to decide once and for all whether the retrials should actually happen. In the end, new trials were denied for Davidson and Cobbins, meaning their original convictions and sentences stood. Thomas and Coleman, however, were granted new trials. For the Christian and Newsom families, this meant sitting through some of the most painful testimony of their lives a second time, listening again to the same forensic details, the same timeline, the same unbearable specifics years after they believed that chapter had already closed. It is worth pausing here on just how close this entire case came to unraveling completely over something that had nothing to do with the evidence itself. A judge's personal struggles, unrelated to the facts of the crime, nearly forced every conviction in one of the most thoroughly documented murder cases in the state's history back to square one. For families who had already sat through the original trials, already heard every graphic detail once, the idea that a technicality involving the judge's own conduct could send them back through that experience again was, in the words of people close to the case, almost harder to process than the original verdicts had been. It is part of why, years later, both families lobbied so hard to change the underlying law that made this possible in the first place, so that no future family would ever be forced to relive a trial because of one person's misconduct on the bench. Vanessa Coleman was retried in November 2012 and convicted again, this time specifically of facilitating the aggravated kidnapping, facilitating the rape, and facilitating the murder of Channon Christian, though she was acquitted of the charges connected to Chris. Her original sentence of 53 years was ultimately reduced to 35 following that retrial. Eric Boyd's path through the legal system took even longer to resolve. For years, he was only convicted on federal charges tied to helping Davidson evade capture and to the carjacking itself, a far lesser set of charges than what the others faced. It was not until 2019, a full 12 years after the murders, that Boyd was finally tried and convicted at the state level on the actual kidnapping, rape, and murder charges, receiving 2 life sentences in addition to 90 more years. Where the case stands today. As difficult as it is to believe, this case has still not fully closed, even now. Lamarcus Davidson remains on death row, and in the years since his conviction, he has filed appeal after appeal, challenging everything from the fairness of his original sentence to the qualifications of the attorneys representing the state against him. As recently as June 2025, Davidson appeared once again in a Knoxville courtroom asking for his death sentence to be set aside. By the end of that same year, a senior judge had denied several more of his requests, including an attempt to have the Tennessee Attorney General's office removed from the case entirely. Gary Christian, Channon's father, has attended nearly every one of those hearings across all these years, and by his own account, he has grown tired of a process that keeps circling back without ever truly ending. He has said plainly that he considers himself already victorious in the ways that matter most to him, because Davidson will never again have the chance to hurt Channon, hurt Channon's children, or hurt anyone else. A small measure of peace he has built for himself, even while the legal process continues to drag on year after year. He has also spoken about finding comfort in quiet, ordinary moments, taking a few minutes at work each morning when the sun comes out to think of Channon and speak to her. A small ritual that has helped him hold on to something steady across 18 years of hearings and appeals. Christopher's parents, Hugh and Mary Newsom, have echoed much the same sentiment in their own words. Mary has said that Chris and Channon were simply 2 of the most innocent young people around, doing exactly what young people are supposed to do on a Saturday night, and that they never should have ended up in that situation, let alone been treated the way they were once they did. Hugh has spoken about the strange, quiet grief of wondering what his son would have become, who he would have been today. Questions that never fully go away no matter how many years pass. Dina Christian, Channon's mother, has said the pain never truly leaves either, that it simply settles into the background of everyday life, always present even during the moments that are supposed to be ordinary and happy. Lori Christian, Gary's wife, has spoken about the ways the family works to keep Channon's memory active rather than letting it sit still, organizing memorial motorcycle rides, toy drives for children in need, and other efforts that keep her name connected to something generous and alive, rather than only to the crime that ended her life. Both families have channeled that grief into something lasting. The Channon Gale Christian Memorial Foundation funds scholarships in her name for local students. The Chris Newsom Memorial Baseball Tournament, held every year at Halls Community Park, has funded more than 40 scholarships for graduating students since it began. The families also successfully pushed Tennessee lawmakers to change the exact legal rule that led to years of additional retrials, removing the requirement for a judge to separately validate a unanimous jury verdict. A change meant to ensure no other family has to sit through what theirs did because of one judge's misconduct. The house at 2316 Chipman Street no longer exists. It was purchased in 2008 by a waste management company with a depot on the neighboring lot, and the house was demolished shortly after with the specific intention of building something better in its place. Today, a quiet memorial to Chris and Channon stands exactly where that house once did. A small but deliberate way of making sure the last physical trace of that address belongs to their memory rather than to what happened inside it. Beyond the physical memorial, both families have worked in different ways to make sure Chris and Channon are remembered as full people rather than only as the names attached to a court case. Scholarship recipients who never met either of them now carry Channon's name and Chris's name forward every year through the funds established in their honor. Local students who play in the annual baseball tournament at Halls Community Park are, whether they fully realize it or not, taking part in something built entirely out of a family's refusal to let their son disappear into a headline. It is the kind of legacy neither family ever wanted to have to build, and also exactly the kind of legacy they have chosen to build anyway. Why this case still matters. There is a reason this case keeps surfacing in true crime conversations nearly 20 years later, and it is not only because of how brutal the crime itself was. It is because of how long the fight for justice has lasted, and how much two families have had to relive simply to keep that justice from slipping away. Every retrial meant reliving the same unbearable testimony. Every new appeal carries with it the possibility, however small, that a unanimous death sentence handed down by a jury could still be undone over a technicality years later. Chris and Channon were, by every account available, an entirely ordinary young couple, remarkable only in how deeply the people around them loved them. What happened to them at Chipman Street was not the kind of random misfortune that a car accident is. It was the result of specific, deliberate choices made by specific people, choices that could have been reversed at almost any point along the way and never were. Nearly 2 decades later, 4 of the 5 people responsible are serving life sentences or worse, and the 5th remains on death row, still appealing, still delaying, while 2 families keep showing up in courtrooms to make sure the world never forgets what was done to their children. If you want to help keep their memory alive, both the Channon Gale Christian Foundation and the Chris Newsom Memorial Fund remain active today, and information on both is easy to find with a quick search. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next one.